Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, part of our Business and Sustainability webinar series. I am Laura Schrake, the Senior Program Director of Business and Sustainability with the Council of the Great Lakes Region. I will be moderating today's webinar, and it is my pleasure to welcome you. Today, we are going to dive into the topic of supply chain resilience in the agri-food industry, an industry that is vital to the economy of the Great Lakes region. Over the next hour, we are going to hear from a multidisciplinary panel of Canadian and US experts who have investigated the agri-food supply chain issues and developed the first phase of a crises management toolbox. I will introduce our esteemed panel in just a moment. First, let me introduce you to the Council of the Great Lakes region and give some context on the region as it relates to today's webinar topic. So for those of you still new to the Council of the Great Lakes region, we are a binational network of organizations solving for sustainability in the North American Great Lakes region. This mega region spans across 8 US states from Minnesota to New York, 2 Canadian provinces, Ontario and Quebec, and many First Nations. Within this region are the Great Lakes, one of the largest surface freshwater systems in the world. They hold roughly 20% of all of Earth's surface freshwater and 84% of North America's. The region is also home to 107 million people, and with a GDP of roughly 6 trillion US dollars, it is recognized as North America's economic engine. Across the Great Lakes region, the Council is convening diverse perspectives and interests to inform and inspire deeper collaborations that will drive systems change and sustainability. And today's webinar is part of those efforts and part of our growing Business and Sustainability Network, an effort funded in part by the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation. The network is engaging business leaders and regional stakeholders in conversations about protecting the Great Lakes environment while also supporting the region's economic growth. And because no one level of government or sector has the power or the resources necessary to solve all of the region's challenges on their own, we are convening stakeholders and developing multi-sector and multi-stakeholder programs and participation. Our focus areas are issues critical to the region, like circular economy, water stewardship, climate change and decarbonization, and sustainable food systems. Farming is one of the primary uses of land in the Great Lakes region, and agri-food trade between the US and Canada is a vital component of the region's economy. Ontario and Quebec, for example, account for roughly 57% of Canada's agriculture and agri-food trade to the US, and the 8 US Great Lakes states account for around 37% of the agriculture and agri-food trade to Canada. And as with all systems, we need to be asking ourselves just how resilient is our agri-food supply chain to external forces, and what happens if and when the food systems we rely on are disrupted. I think it's safe to say that we have all experienced some inconveniences by the supply chain disruption that was brought on by the pandemic. I know some of us, our favorite foods were no longer reliably stocked on grocery store shelves, or if they were, we saw their prices increasing. So certainly an important question to be asking ourselves and investigating. And our panel of experts with us today have investigated this issue, evaluating the drivers and incentives that formed the current supply chain dependencies and rethinking the approach to emergent threats. As a result, they developed the first phase of a crises management toolbox. And today we will meet members of this team of experts. We'll hear about the increasing vulnerabilities the agri-food industry faces, the consultations and case studies that informed the toolbox development, and the variables that must be considered to mitigate risks. So with us today, we have John Fisk. John is founder and president of Bluestem Food Systems Consulting and has broad experience and knowledge in sustainable food and agricultural systems development. Sanjay Khanna, who is a scenario planning expert and is chief futurist of SK Futures, dedicated to enhancing resiliency during our era of converging crises. And Thomas Armstrong. Tom is president of the consulting firm Madison River Group. He previously served within the White House during the Obama administration as the executive director of the U.S. Global Change Research Program. I also want to mention Karen Hand, a biostatistician who is also part of the expert team. Karen, unfortunately, is not able to join us as planned, but I do want to mention her as she was a very big part in getting this webinar together. So we have quite the esteemed panel. I'm thrilled to have them joining us today and sharing their expertise. To kick us off, I will hand it over to Sanjay to give a presentation on the research and toolbox. After the presentation, we'll use the remaining time for a Q&A session with the panelists. So if the audience has any questions, I invite you to please type them into the Zoom Q&A. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you. And Abby, would you please bring up the first slide, or title slide? Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it was wonderful that Laura acknowledged Dr. Karen Hand's contributions to making the session happen, and also to providing me these excellent notes to support the presentation I'll be giving today. So I'm acting on Karen's behalf to deliver this presentation. We'd like to thank CJLR for inviting us here today, and Laura and Abby for their work to make this happen, both in front of the camera and behind the scenes. Also, thanks to all of you for taking the time to engage with us today on what's probably the deepest issue of societal resilience that we face around the world is agri-food resilience. So this presentation is a very high-level overview of the findings in our report called Canadian Agri-Food Resilience, a Toolbox for Managing Crises. The report was commissioned by the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, which wanted to explore ideas on how to strengthen Canadian agri-food supply chain resilience in light of local, regional, and global events and disruptions such as climate change, disease, pandemics, and geopolitical conflicts. Our work was funded by the Agri-Risk Initiative of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which is the Canadian federal government counterpart to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Next slide, please. So our team was assembled by two people who are not on camera, but the project coordinators of this effort were two wonderful gentlemen named William McClooney and Bruce Stephen. And Bruce and William assembled our team from Canada and the US to deliver this report. We had 7 months to complete the project. We knew there was a large body of work already underway and completed, as well as various programs for risk management and various recommendations around that. What we found missing was the dialogue from a systems perspective. What was a systems view that really captured the phase we're living through as the planet, the Earth system change that affect agri-food and agriculture and have other knock-on impacts that we aren't really addressing. So we quickly embraced the idea of a framework with relevant tools that would lead to a paradigm shift in how the agri-food sector understood, defined, and planned against the current risk opportunity landscape. So this report is more than do some research and then report. It provides tools for active engagement beyond the consultations undertaken by our team. Next slide. Our report was published on September 13th of this year. And within 2 weeks, Canada's leading agri-food publication got 6 members of its editorial team together, and they wrote an editorial that stated that CAPI's latest report should set the stage for pivotal change in how Canada's agricultural and food sector sets its future course. And that led us to ask the question, does this approach also set the stage for thinking about pivotal regional change in the context of the Great Lakes region? The report gave substance and language. It recognizes the challenges that were already on people's minds, but difficult to conceptualize and put into words when dealing with immediate crises. And so we had a chance to kind of step back and put into words and conceptualize things that people were thinking about but felt too overwhelmed to build a framework and a set of ideas around. And that's a really critical piece here. If you can't comprehend the contextual environment, it's very difficult to know where to act and where to make a difference. Next slide, please. So in the consultation, in regards to the dynamic system and the challenges that we face, one of the consultation participants said that we farmers aren't prepared for disruption, not even close. And this is in the context of a dynamic system. And one of the things Dr. Hand really brought to this project was really bringing a view of the dynamic system within which the agricultural and agri-food system sort of operates. So in working through the tools and framework to support decision-making, from a systems perspective, it was very important to recognize that agriculture encompasses and is part of a complete complex dynamic system. Karen also points out that the farm to fork metaphor promotes a linear view of agriculture when in fact the agricultural system is comprised of many actors, producers, trusted advisors, for-profit and not-for-profit entities and regulatory bodies. Something that directly affects one node can affect and yield impacts on other nodes within the system that on the surface appear unrelated, as the line of sight isn't linear. So mapping out what the dynamic interrelationships are as the system faces changes is kind of critical here. Many sectors outside of agriculture and food, unless fully vertically integrated, and even then, are complex and dynamic, involving numerous actors and organizations. And very evident is the binational nature of the Council of the Great Lakes region and its multiple and varied stakeholder organizations that are operating in a dynamic system. Next slide, please. Given the limited time to complete the project, we had 7 months, we focused on 3 major forces of disruption impacting Canadian agri-food: geopolitics, pandemic, and climate change. We also focused on the swine and greenhouse sectors as representative commodities. In the short term, crises are often approached in isolation, one and done. However, today is different, and every sector and supply chain is grappling with the impacts of climate change, geopolitics, and human, animal, and plant diseases, as well as the threats they pose to our societal, environmental, and economic well-being. The impacts and effects of these disruptors are long-term and complex and have implications for decades to come. Next slide, please. We are operating in an era of converging crises with 3 or more simultaneous, intersecting, compounding, and/or cascading crises becoming common. It is no longer business as usual, and we are seeing a redistribution of costs, benefits, and risks. Current resilience strategies need to address the dynamic nature of supply chains, the convergence of interrelated and compounding crises. They need to adapt to the changing threat landscape in a timely manner. So what can be done in the here and now of strategy development to build resilience in supply chains? Next slide. What we heard in the consultations was sort of across the board as themes. We had 6 regional consultations across Canada that encompassed the country on a national level. And we learned that stakeholders believe there's a lack of a long-term strategy, that the strategy window doesn't extend past 5 years, and that some entity needs to invest in horizons 10 years to 30 years out and beyond. That there are vast supply chain vulnerabilities, some of which have been really captured and some that are still in people's notes and in their minds that haven't actually been mapped out to the reality that the industry, the agri-food system faces. And this cuts across the supply chain from farmer, processor, retailer tensions to trade conflict, input costs, and so on. There's a talk action gap that the understanding of key risks and threats is unevenly distributed, and action isn't commensurate with today's best state of understanding. So again, across the various participants and stakeholders in this that covered all the way from the production all the way to processing and farmers to other stakeholders, industry associations, and so on, that everyone felt there was a talk action gap. And then there's the question in technology and cyber-related issues that they're proliferating and can affect the entire supply chain, including food safety, distribution, and more. Ransomware came up, and concerns about which stakeholders in the agri-food system had enough resilience for various kinds of cyber and technology-related issues. Next slide. So in all of this, we need a long-term agri-food strategy. And not just in Canada, but in the Great Lakes region and around the world. We need a new level of strategic acumen and situational awareness to build resilience within our supply chains and therefore across our societies. Stakeholders are key, but they need a structured approach, one that encompasses a wide range of expertise and decision support resources. And the decision support piece is key. This work is meant to enable and empower the right configurations of stakeholder engagement that value voices and have a structured approach to decision-making and to understanding the context. So to identify vulnerabilities, develop a keen sense of understanding of the impact of various disruptors, assess risk tolerance, respond with appropriate action across key sectors, and importantly, iterate and monitor. This is not a task that can be undertaken in isolation by one part of the sector alone. And that is why we developed a toolbox for managing crises. Next slide. So this toolbox involves, is based on principles of structured decision-making. The toolbox consists of 6 key tools to support stakeholders in understanding the complex risk landscape in which they reside, enabling them to make informed decisions on actions and allocations of resources. So I'll take the first 2, participatory engagement and case studies. Participatory engagement asks, what keeps you up at night? We engaged in over 100 discussions with agri-food stakeholders through individual conversations and 6 regional workshops across Canada and across a broad spectrum of stakeholders in the agri-food supply chain. The consultations and case studies provided the information required to gain situational awareness, to understand what is going on, to know what is important, and to gain a well-rounded perspective on future implications. Insights and knowledge acquired helped identify several pertinent disruptive forces and vulnerabilities currently impacting the system and helped to define the required criteria and assumptions. For example, the study of COVID vulnerability mapping in our report was completed as a retrospective exercise with stakeholders in the Canadian pork and greenhouse commodity sectors within a 5-month interval time of October 2022 to March 2023. It would be interesting today to hear from people about what keeps them up at night right now. Going to vulnerability mapping, which is number 3 on the right-hand side of your screen, we translated what keeps stakeholders up at night to system-level vulnerabilities, which required a step beyond listening. A visual map was required to begin to see emerging themes, patterns, and clusters. In our report, we show one branch related to vulnerabilities that were identified during COVID, such as input, export market access, labor disruption, and market volatility. Other identified vulnerabilities included emerging disease, export-related border issues, vulnerability of infrastructure to extreme weather, climate trends, regulation and public policy, farm succession, and labor. In terms of labor disruptions, farm, transportation, processing, facilities, ports, That was a very dominant theme and very relatable to the Great Lakes region, given the recent St. Lawrence Seaway strike affecting numerous commodities, steel, and including agricultural inputs and products, corn, soybeans, barley, oats, and wheat. Vulnerability mapping helps bring these and other concerns forward for discussion, analysis, and planning among stakeholders. When it comes to force disruptor vulnerabilities, which is the lower right portion of your screen, that's really a visualization tool that describes the cause and effect relationships between disruptors and identified vulnerabilities. The mapping requires a transdisciplinary team and expertise. In our report, we relied on Dr. Armstrong's expertise as a climate and global change science expert to associate impacts and effects of geopolitical instability and climate change on identified vulnerabilities. One example of a pathway moves us through from climate change to the degradation of the cryosphere, to drought flood shifts, to accelerated water loss and supply chain efficiencies. The approach to vulnerability mapping provides a simplified way to capture and illustrate the integrated and, in many cases, synergistic behavior of disruptive forces and their impacts on system vulnerabilities. Again, we see emerging themes that transcend agri-food. 5 on the left bottom hand of the screen is risk topography. Risk topography is a visualization tool that quantifies the impacts of disruptive forces and related synergies on vulnerabilities. Quantitative results are summarized in data layers overlaid to create a visual image. In our report, we created a simulated risk topography based on our findings as they relate to 2 extreme weather events: Hurricane Fiona that made landfall on the coast of Nova Scotia in September of 2022, and the British Columbia floods in November of 2022. In this scenario, multiple disruptive forces impacting agri-food were identified, including extreme weather driven by climate change, climate trends, COVID-19 disease, geopolitics, domestic politics, and economics. The impacts of these disruptions on system vulnerabilities are then quantified and captured as data layers, 1 per vulnerability. Examples include labor transportation corridors, emergency operations center membership, on-farm inventory, informative policy, communications pathways, disaster recovery programs, and insurance. These data layers, when fully integrated, think of a tracing paper just layered up on top of each other, define the risk topography and the visualization. We would imagine that many sectors and organizations participating in today's session can directly relate to these findings. And finally, foresight analysis, number 6, coming around to full circle, involves reviewing contributions gathered in the participatory consultations and determining where gaps may exist in stakeholders' perception of risks. Buttressing those gaps with additional research and determining relevant new elements of planning, investment, and regulatory and compliance positions that could help to reduce risks or increase the chances of capitalizing on opportunities. Foresight analysis can contribute to scenario planning, the development of multiple plausible, memorable, useful, and distinct scenarios of a conceptual future that is 1, 3, 10 years out, or even 50 years out. Scenario planning provides narratives for multiple plausible futures that engage stakeholders and allows strategy teams to identify how organizations might navigate a radically uncertain context, interact in the transactional environment with the stakeholders, and inform strategy in the here and now and make organizations more resilient to plausible futures. The purpose of foresight analysis and scenario planning is not to predict the future, rather it is to establish well-informed opinions about the future via a set of plausible, evidence-informed narratives that can be discussed and turned over for participants using a common language. The Toolbox for Managing Crises, built to support Canadian agri-food, is broadly applicable to any supply chain dealing with converging crises in a complex dynamic ecosystem. The Toolbox is an innovative integration of 6 tools that naturally build sequentially and in the aggregate deliver a powerful decision support process product to identify best use of resources and where co-benefits are realizable. One thing we understood from this work is that the challenges seem to be so overwhelming to individual stakeholders that having a structured approach that allows the issues to be framed in a way that starts to become manageable, is what will yield the creative solutions to the resourcing type issues. In a time of weakening and aging policy development, and social infrastructure, there's great urgency to act and decisions need to be made. Given that agriculture is a significant sector for the well-being of the Great Lakes region, from a systems perspective, you can see how increasing input costs are affecting farms. Farmers are under increasing pressure to adopt technologies and change, and they need best management practice related to sustainability. The Great Lakes region can expect to see increased population growth as the planet warms. More food will be needed. We need to plan ahead. We need to invest the time for long-term planning for the agricultural and food sector and for all important sectors within the Great Lakes region. Slide. So moving forward, on both sides of the Canada-US border, our team will champion an interdisciplinary and interprofessional collaboration approach that includes the tools we mentioned: foresight analysis, global change and climate change science, data science informed by biostatistics and epidemiology, as well as resilient agricultural supply chains, the area of Dr. Fisk's expertise. Provide consultative services so that our mission-critical approach helps agri-food system stakeholders develop a long-term vision and translates that vision to bold strategies and actions now and in the very near term. We welcome partnerships that enable further development and validation of the toolkit for managing crises, working with industry associations, public policy leaders, corporate executives, and farming stakeholders. And next slide. And thank you. We're very grateful for your time. This is a quote from Keith Currie, the president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. He said in a recent article published a few weeks after our report was released, he said, "We need this, but we don't have anything. We're not learning from past situations. There's no big picture plan on how we react to that and how we deal with that." As co-authors of this report, we're glad we sort of, through a bit of an acupuncture prick, we've kind of hit the pain point that is at the center of what is keeping people up at night, as well as making that more granular. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Thomas Armstrong, Dr. John Fisk, Dr. Karen Hand, and our project coordinators, Bruce Stephen and William McClooney, to the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And the final slide is, if you have any follow-up inquiries after the Q&A, for subject matter expertise, you can contact Dr. Hand, and for business leads, you can reach out to Bruce Stephen. Thanks very much, and I'll turn it over to Laurie for Q&A.
Thank you, Sanjay. Yeah, I found the insights in the report really interesting, so I'm excited to dive into it with you all. So I invite Tom and John to join us, and we'll start with a couple of questions of my own and a few questions that came in with the registrations, and then we'll jump to some questions that come in from our audience. We have about 30 minutes left, so I will go ahead and get started with my first question, and that is that the report was commissioned by the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute and looks at the Canadian agri-food sector. But can you take a few minutes to connect the work further to the binational Great Lakes region, and I guess, you know, if how the approach would be applied to the Great Lakes, and if there would be any unique opportunities or challenges on that regional perspective.
I'll hand that to Tom and John. Maybe you can build on each other. Tom, would you like to start?
Oh, Tom, I believe you're muted. In the bottom left of your Zoom screen.
Sorry.
There you go. Oh, you're muted again.
Sorry about that. It's a gremlin today, I guess. I'm going to actually, after all that trouble I caused, go to John on this because I think it's built more around the agri-food system. But I will say that the bottom line to everything that Sanjay was really talking about was that there's not a simple linear set of consequences from forces to the impacts and effects on any sector of the globe that we look at. It really is a very multivariate environment. And one of the things that we were all surprised by was just how multivariate things can be, and things that you thought were related to just social or economic forces or drivers turned out to have major impacts on nature and the physical environment. So you really have to look at a system in totality. And that, I think the Great Lakes, from all the work that I've done through the Department of the Interior and the White House, it's always been an area of where there's been an incredible need for integrated science, integrative decision making, and a real integrated approach to structured decision making. And I think that the agriculture piece is just one facet of it. I think the sky is the limit in terms of the different sectors and different issues that could really benefit from a full integrated approach like the one that we used in Canada. So John, let me turn it to you, because I think this question was really looking more towards agriculture than it was the process.
Yeah, well, I think the backdrop you provided is critical. I mean, the Great Lakes is a microcosm for both the intensity and the expansiveness of what we've developed in agriculture and in our societies, right? You've got critical mass of populations, critical mass of industry. You've got aging infrastructure that I think represents the U.S. and many parts of the world. So the issues that we dealt with in looking at agriculture kind of as a proxy for all our systems, I think they represent what we're going to see. And of course, the other unique thing about the Great Lakes is the natural environment that's so critical: the waterways, the fresh water, the access to water, its representation as a water source and an environment or an ecosystem important not just to the two countries but to the globe. And so, I think the vulnerabilities and the impacts of disruptions and the converging disruptions are going to play out so profoundly in the Great Lakes that I think this process that we've designed and the tools and the call to action around the conversations are critical. And so it becomes a great laboratory in a sense, but it's also a living laboratory where these are real actions. And we saw that in agriculture. You have cross-border transportation of live animals. You have cross-border transportation of diseases inadvertently through the global supply chains, right? This is just part of how it goes. And labor, of course, and we saw with this disruption of COVID, the impacts on labor. The aging infrastructure thing is really, really important. I mean, I'm from upstate New York. I live in Michigan. These are, we used to call them Rust Belt states. Maybe we still call them that, and that's because a lot of that infrastructure that was built 180 years ago or more now is to be replaced, whether it be water systems, transportation systems, ports and locks and things like that. And so as we make those decisions, those investments now, it becomes so critical to have a longer term vision and a longer term understanding of what it is we're going to be up against in order to create resilient systems that keep us safe, one, that keep our economy humming, two, and that keep our agriculture and our food systems flowing. So maybe I'll stop there because I know we've got other questions, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the only little build I'd make is that it's a moving target, and that's why this kind of analysis is needed. When looking in terms of a dynamic system, we're also looking at the dynamism of the future state, not assuming it's static.
Yeah, and is it recommended that this approach that's been taken be taken by governments, by industry groups, even smaller individual businesses?
You want to take that, Tom?
Yeah, I think the answer is unequivocally yes, that we're really trying to break away from the paradigm of looking at things in a linear sequential arrangement, and realizing that the globe and the problems associated with the globe are much more complex than just one-offs. And the more that we treat the various social, physical, political, biological, atmospheric, the more we treat each of these individual forces or issues as a separate entity with borders around it, so that it just follows a linear path, the more trouble we're going to run into down in the future. This is especially true with things like climate change, which are force multipliers or force impacts that transcend any of the given sectors or issues that we face today. It by itself, climate change is bad enough, but when it actually amplifies problems in other sectors, in other parts of society or nature, it creates unintended consequences or surprises that we never really had thought of that we needed to deal with before. So our way of looking at this, and it's not just our way, other people have looked this way, it's how we visualize looking at it and what we integrate into it, we think is really critical for any scale and any scope of problem. Otherwise, you're going to miss you may miss something in your system that you never really thought of as being relevant to the problem that you're actually trying to solve.
And it cuts across planning, risk, and operations. So it means how you plan for it, how you understand the risk environment, and then what you actually do on the ground tangibly. They all affect each other. And we're trying to get faster from the planning and the risk to the actual action.
Yeah. If I could just add to that, I mean, one of the things we saw in both the swine industry as well as the greenhouse veg industry, I mean, they are planning, right? These industry sectors do plan, but it's a shorter term, it's 3 to 5 years, and they're really dealing with things in their silo as they need to be, right? We're talking about swine disease. We're talking about, rugose in fresh vegetables in greenhouses. We're talking about, the infrastructure needs and electricity costs and things like that. But those are immediate shorter term things, yet critical. But at the same time, there hasn't been the bandwidth to look at preparing for climate change and how it's going to interact with those things, right? Because we live in a global supply chain that's moving very quickly, and it demands a lot of everybody. So to make space in the planning to plan for these longer term things is difficult. And so I don't think you can do it just sector by sector, and yet you need to do it in those sectors in relationship and in partnership with the larger vessel of government and civil society, et cetera.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot to consider, and it can't be done in isolation. What about and you touched on it earlier with the transborder, but like with governance and transboundary transborder issues that need to be addressed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll start and just say that, the work I've done in the Arctic is really, especially across 8 countries that have a real vested interest and land within and sovereignty issues within the Arctic, let alone all the indigenous sovereignty issues that are equally as important. If we don't look at those things in the same way, across any of the borders that you're talking about, we think of transnational as Canada and then jumping over into the United States, but with NAFTA and trade agreements and with indigenous issues and other countries where 8 countries can intersect essentially within the Arctic Ocean, if people aren't using similar kinds of paradigms or operating out of similar types of paradigms or using similar structured decision-making processes, you really run the risk of comparing apples to oranges when it's time to sit down and start to negotiate. And we've already seen in places where some of these tools have been employed successfully, we've already seen that where the tool can actually be a problem amplifier if it's not used uniformly across all the different vested parties. So that's a real lesson learned for me, has been in working on negotiating on climate. If we're not all using the same paradigm, within the same paradigm of thought and logic, you really have a difficult road ahead in trying to negotiate successfully for some outcome of mutual benefit to the parties.
Yep, thanks, Tom. I also want to ask, and I think it's the last step in the toolbox, is the foresight and the scenario planning. And so I'm wondering if you can just sort of expand a little bit on the role that has. And I'm particularly curious how scenario planning can help get us to thinking about like water-related risks, particularly in a region like the Great Lakes that is water rich. So it's often just sort of taken for granted. So where would, I guess, that final step of the scenario planning or the foresight come in with that?
Sanjay?
Yeah, I think the piece there that is important is that you need to do all the other steps first and have that real strong participatory work, the stakeholder engagement. You need to support that with the research and the mapping, and you have to do all that work. So by the time you get to the foresight analysis piece, you've built the relationships that are critical to making any discussions related to scenario planning work well. The other piece there is that it's a neglected area, but many successful companies and organizations use it quite quietly to understand how they're going to operate in the environment, and they do quiet stakeholder outreach and that kind of thing. Because of the nature of the multiple sectors involved in agri-food supply chains and other supply chains, using this in a way that's transparent, that obeys some principles of transparency around the contributions, and then the research that's done to inform the development of the scenarios that can then be used in participatory discussions to set a North Star for where folks need to go and how they might need to respond to this disruptive environment. That's what's key. So I'd say that the foresight piece, it really needs to tie into all the hard work that's done to build the relationships across stakeholders before you get there.
Thanks, Sanjay. We had a question come in from Tracy with the registration, and the question is, what kinds of climate related issues do you see in the supply problem in the Great Lakes for like food crops, and climate threats in delivery?
Well, I guess they're going to want me to do this one, but I would say right off the bat that I could sit here and list various problems that I think the Great Lakes are going to try to suffer through over the course of the next decade or 100 years. And a lot of this has been covered in things like IPCC and several Canadian assessments as well, climate assessments for what's on the north side of the boundary. But I would say that, and I don't want this to sound like a cop-out, it's not meant to be, but the more precise you can be about identifying what are the actual climate forces and associated impacts and effects, the more accurate we can be about that, or the more precise in describing what it is we're looking at and what's being impacted and how, the more effective the entire methodology we've gone through will be. So I would actually turn it around to the audience and say, I'd like to hear from you what you think some of the major impacts are for the near term as well as the long-term future. Or what are some of the challenges you're going through now that you think are climate related? That would be the best place to start. And that's something that Sanjay hit on, is stakeholder engagement is a profoundly important first step in building the foundation for structured decision-making. And it really has to start with you.
Yeah, I think one of the things we noticed in the consultations and discussions, and this might be something that John can build on, is that when we asked we sent out questionnaires and we asked people really deep and hard questions about what they were struggling with, what was keeping them up at night, what are some things they thought were just barriers that couldn't be overcome because of whatever kinds of inertia are in there. And they were very honest and forthright in their descriptions. So when we did the actual stakeholder consultations, we weren't telling people things, we were surfacing what they already saw and maybe adding or augmenting to that in asking questions, right? And so we were actually very nicely heartened by the level of knowledge that was there, but it was in the group setting where people could see what other people were saying and thinking and feeling and what they were doing that really added a lot, because the other stakeholders also saw each other and saw their observations. So you're not doing it in isolation. You're not by yourself in your room in a corner looking up reports and figuring out, what the problem is. You're with others, seeing what the patterns are, and then seeing where you can have an impact on addressing that. And so everyone's becoming a bit more clear through that process and less alone and overwhelmed by it as well. John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you guys have provided some big picture, but I think part of what the question is asking are specifics, right? And Tom's right that those things have been detailed. And in fact, on Laura, on your website, there's a pretty nice paper kind of saying what is climate change going to mean for livestock, for plants, for agriculture in the Great Lakes, right? And it has a lot to do with temperature impacts. For example, one example given is that dairy cows don't do well under elevated temperatures, and as we're seeing elevated temperatures increase, this is a big dairy area all across the Great Lakes, right? So just things like that. Fruits do not set, grains do not fill when we don't have moisture, when we don't have the right temperature. Pollination doesn't happen when we don't have the right conditions. Our entire food system is built upon research, upon conditions that we know and have enjoyed for a long time. And those conditions are changing quite rapidly. And so how do we mobilize and change in response to that? It's extremely difficult, right? And it's mostly difficult because everybody's locked into the existing market model, right? Those are strong global supply chain forces. And so how do we make a shift? We need to loosen the grip of that market model, and we need to invest in a more resilient system that's adaptable, right? That maybe is a bit more decentralized, that considers not just profits, but needs, right? Because this is about, not survivals to extreme, but this is about, agriculture and food systems are here to serve people, right? Not to serve just the business endeavor that brings them to us. And so there needs to be a sharing of goals in the system so that we can respond. And some of that might mean a changing of scale and a changing of processing and ownership spread more so that we can diversify. There's going to be considering places that don't fit into the market model, such as rural areas, right, where we need to actually continue our distribution. We need to run supply chain routes out there, even if it doesn't make us as much money as it would make in an urban area. So those kind of things. And this is, that played out extremely clearly in indigenous communities during the pandemic, when we saw, the supply chain disruptions to those. So, there's lots of examples of how I'll end with one of the other examples we saw in our study was the impact of heat on live animal transport, right? The swine industry cuts across, all of Canada, and it cuts across into the US. So there's a lot of transport of live animals. And so, there's a animal humane issue with transporting under these changing conditions. So those sound like mundane and solvable things, but when you get so many of them in such a short period of time, it's not.
Yeah, thank you for that example. I think it's helpful to have those examples. And since we've touched a little bit on the consultations that you held, I'm going to jump to one of the questions that we just received from Elsa, and because she's asking about the listening sessions and wondering about in the conversation if there was anything that was raised around watershed protections and how watershed protections are being seen by agribusiness stakeholders. Is that something that
course.
was brought up?
It was not something that was really strongly emphasized. Sanjay, in any of the sessions you were in, because we definitely didn't map that out.
Yeah, we didn't map it out, but it did come up as a concern, mostly from what my recollection, Tom, from the farmers themselves, who
From what,
were
Sanjay?
farmers themselves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but we didn't hear it from the agribusiness stakeholders as a primary thing they raised in the conversation.
But
Okay.
I will say that, to that question, whoever asked it, that's a damn good question. And I think you already know the answer to it. Water is the lifeblood of all of these things we've been talking about. And especially when it comes to agriculture, it really is the lifeblood. And if we don't start protecting the watersheds, that many of which are going dry in most parts of the United States, at least. I'm not an expert on Canadian water issues by any stretch, but I'm sure you're still running into the same problems we are in the United States. That if we don't come up with better ways of looking out way beyond just a couple of years and treating water as a non-stationary issue, we're gonna be in a world of hurt. I think we already are in a lot of parts of the United States. So watershed protection is got to be a paramount priority for just helping to stabilize some of the other things that we're looking at, like agriculture, and other things as well.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, and on the water side, I mean, we are seeing some private sector innovations in understanding what's happening to watersheds, the groundwater, surface water interaction, and those sorts of things, and they need to be kind of a part of all of this too.
But I just have to jump in and say that I've been involved with the Colorado River Water Compact issues, which are well over 100 years old now. And when you don't keep ahead in the current thinking of how a system works, and yet it's still part of your existing policy, you're going to run into many of the same problems we've been talking about ever since we started this talk today. And it is a major issue. One of the things that you have to start with, as we said, is everybody's got to be on the same page with a systems level thinking and a modern systems level thinking. We've got to put the old way of thinking, including the old way of policy making, away for good, because the world that we're going to live in for maybe forever is going to be a much more dynamic world than anything that was seen 150 years ago.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I want to jump to another question that has just come in live, because I know I saw this when I read the report, that it was a topic that was brought up by the stakeholders, is the succession planning. And the question comes in from Susan, and she says, succession planning is a big problem. We have a lot of retiring farmers that don't know what options are available to them. The next generation doesn't necessarily want to farm. So what happens to those farms? Can you shed some light on some of the comments that you were hearing during your sessions?
Yeah, looks like a great
we can.
John.
Yeah,
go for it.
So we kind of heard that from both supply chains, both sectors of agriculture, and from multiple growers and others. I mean, even probably the overarching comment is, agriculture and food systems have become more consolidated and larger business entities, right? And so the passing of those entities on to the next generation is a much more formidable task than one would think. We had one grower, say that his farm was his father's farm, but for his son to take it over is going to require an immense amount of investment and money to be bought out, in a sense, right? And so where's his son going to get that, and how does he qualify for that kind of financing? Just the mechanics of it, let alone the interest, right? Which I think as our rural areas empty out, they become less and less attractive for the next generation to stay there. So I think that's one. The other we saw in in the greenhouse sector, which, if you think about it, is a very different type of agriculture. It's much more concentrated. It's much more tech heavy, right? And there's a lot of upfront financing in these controlled environments. I don't know if you've seen them, but they're quite remarkable, large, multi-thousand square footage greenhouses covered in glass with high technology temperature control systems inside with high value crops. And so again, but they're still often in more rural areas. And the next generation, how do they get into them? Do they want to get into them? Is there enough reliability and income? Right? We saw that farmer quote saying, we're not ready for disruption. Farmers don't make money every year, and they're living on debt in order to move forward. It's a very it's a difficult place to be when you've got a global supply chain and you're just a small piece of it. So we've heard that a lot. On the other hand, part of the resilience strategy going out of COVID, I think we're seeing an interest in diversifying the size of farms, the location of farms, if not just to create more diversity on the landscape so that when we do have disruptions, there are options, that we're not just relying upon one of four meat processing facilities in the entire nation, that type of thing. We're seeing that kind of concentration. So it's key.
Yeah, I mean, the other build on that is that we had some farm finance stakeholders and things like that were part of this. And so you can see how this question of farm succession extends into financing, into insurance, into technological know-how. And we also, although Susan mentions that, young folks don't necessarily want to take over the farm, we were also hearing from a number of stakeholders whose kids did want to take over the farm, and they needed resources to stay in the game, and they're learning about ag in a high-tech way. They're wanting to figure out what the latest ways to protect against climate risks and other risks are in their supply chains, and it's often younger farmers doing that work without a lot of support and resources to do that work. So the decision support model we have here of trying to support all those stakeholders with these methods is kind of critical if we're going to maintain that farm succession.
Yeah, and I guess this will be sort of the last question, because I see that we're running out of time. But in order, how do we ensure that the toolbox that you have put together, how do we ensure that it's getting used by the right people, and that it really can lead to this resiliency building that we need in agri-food, but also hopefully other industries as well?
That's an excellent question. Tom, you want to say something? I was just going to say that Bruce is our person who's been getting all the outreach from the industry associations in Canada and others, and so we're hoping that some of this will go viral and reach the right people, and also working with you at CGLR and having the opportunity to speak to your stakeholders, we hope will be part of the momentum and relationship and partnership building that can allow that to happen. That's my thought. Tom and John.
Yeah, I'm just going to simply, I think what you hit it, Sanjay, but just to add a little bit to it. I think demonstrating the value add, that the process and value is beyond just financial value. There's different ways of evaluating any system. But I think if we can show value add across, not just within one system, but across systems, I think that's a great way of making your tools relevant to a broader audience. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, and I would just jump in there that's saying, this is a business decision, right? We've realized that sustainability for companies is a business decision. It's not a choice anymore. And so this is really an extension of sustainability to come face to face with these larger disruptions and to invest in that for the future, right? You need to invest in your long-term business viability, and that's what this is. And same for government. We need to invest in the long-term health of our communities and our constituencies. So
that's great. I think that is a perfect place to end. So John, Sanjay, Tom, thank you so much for sharing the insights of this report and your expertise. I'd also like to thank everybody who joined us today and put some questions forward for our expert panel. A recording of the webinar will be sent out next week, along with a link to the report. We are always trying to build new informative content for our regional audience. And so we'd be grateful to receive feedback from the audience. We will have a survey going out by email shortly. So we'd be grateful for any feedback that you can share. But yeah, thank you again, Sanjay, John, Tom, really appreciate it. Really loved this discussion. So thank you.